It's a crazy day, you know. We talked about it last night, and she told me that she was in fear for her life last night, and I actually helped her lock up the house and get everything together, and then this happened.
September 20th, 2022. A Tuesday that started with ordinary morning routines in Atascocita, Texas. Coffee brewing, children getting ready for school, the familiar sounds of suburban life beginning another day. But for one mother, this Tuesday would become the day she made a decision that would set into motion events no one could have predicted. Her name was Takara Glenn, though everyone who knew her called her Key. At 34 years old, she was the mother of 6 children, ranging from just 12 months old to 6 years. On this particular Tuesday, while her youngest napped and her older children were at school, Key picked up her phone and made a call that would seal her fate. She wasn't calling a friend, she wasn't calling family. She was calling the police department, and her question was simple yet loaded with desperation. How do I file a restraining order? Now, we don't know exactly what was going through Key's mind as she held that phone, but we can only assume her heart was racing. The decision to reach out for legal protection isn't one that comes lightly. It's born from fear, from exhaustion, from the realization that things have gone too far and something needs to change immediately. What Key didn't know as she spoke to that officer, asking about paperwork and procedures, was that this single phone call would trigger a countdown. She had just started a clock that would tick down to the most dangerous 48 hours of her life. The very act of seeking safety, of trying to protect herself and her children, would become the catalyst for unimaginable tragedy. But let's pause here for a moment. When we hear about domestic violence cases, we often think about the obvious signs: visible bruises, emergency room visits, neighbors calling 911 during loud arguments. What we don't always consider is the courage it takes for someone to make that first official call for help. To admit that the person who promised to love and protect them has become the person they most fear. Key lived in a beautiful home in Atascocita, a community northeast of Houston known for its family-friendly neighborhoods and good schools. From the outside, her life looked complete. She was married to Gregory Hightower, a Navy senior chief with nearly 2 decades of military service. They had 6 beautiful children together. Gregory had a stable career, and they lived in a nice area where children could ride bikes and families gathered for barbecues. But behind closed doors, something had been building. Something that had already prompted police visits to their home. Something that had created enough fear in Key's heart that she felt compelled to make that call about a restraining order. What makes this story particularly devastating is not just what happened next, but when it happened. You see, Key wasn't just making random phone calls about protection. She was being proactive. She was trying to get ahead of a situation that she clearly sensed was escalating beyond her control. And here's where this case becomes truly extraordinary and heartbreaking. In exactly 48 hours from the moment Key made that call, federal agents would indeed be inside her home. But they wouldn't be there to serve a restraining order. They wouldn't be there for a routine follow-up visit. They would be there because Key had taken another brave step. She had agreed to speak with Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents, NCIS, about her marriage, about what was happening behind the doors of their suburban Texas home. She was ready to tell her story officially, on the record. On Thursday, September 22nd, at 1:30 in the afternoon, Key would be sitting in her own living room, holding one of her babies, speaking to federal investigators about her husband's behavior. She would finally be getting the official help she had sought. She would be taking control of her situation. But Gregory Hightower had other plans. What happened next would expose the darkest truth about domestic violence: that the most dangerous time for a victim isn't necessarily when they're living in silence. It's often when they decide to speak up, when they reach for help, when they try to break free. The next 48 hours would prove that sometimes seeking protection can paradoxically put you in the greatest danger of your life. Key's story would become a stark reminder that the bravest act, asking for help, can also be the most perilous. As we continue this story, we'll meet the woman behind that phone call. We'll learn about Key's life, her dreams, her dedication to her children, and the relationship that would ultimately cost her everything. We'll understand why she felt compelled to make that call, and we'll see how the system she trusted to protect her would fail in the most tragic way possible. But first, we want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell us what you think. Is it dangerous for domestic violence victims to seek help? Have you ever wondered why some people don't just leave an abusive relationship? Share your thoughts and let us know where you're watching from today. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we need to meet the real Takara Glenn Hightower. Not as a victim, but as the vibrant, devoted woman she was every single day of her 34 years. Key was born on January 4, 1988, in Peoria, Illinois, to Scott E. Scott Sr. and Shanitha Glenn. From the very beginning, there was something special about this little girl who would grow up to touch so many lives. Her family gave her the nickname Key, and it stuck throughout her entire life, a name that friends and family spoke with warmth and affection. But if you wanted to know what truly made Key come alive, you only had to mention her children. She had 6 of them: Gavin, Gioni, Danielle, Gabriella, Giselle, and Gianna. Their ages spanned from her youngest at just 12 months old to her oldest at 6 years. And Kai? She lived and breathed for every single one of them. Her friend Christina Ezel would later describe Key as someone whose selfless, caring, and relentless spirit shined bright in her children's eyes. But this wasn't just poetic language. This was Key's daily reality. She was the mom who never missed a basketball game, no matter how early or how far away. She was front row at every choir concert, cheering louder than any other parent in the auditorium. School events, recitals, sports practices, Key was there, without fail, serving as her children's #1 fan. There was something almost magical about watching Key with her babies. She had this deep, instinctual love for every stage of motherhood. She cherished pregnancy, got excited about labor and delivery, and had this incredible connection to newborns that went beyond typical maternal bonds. Friends remember her talking about how much she loved even the unique scent that babies have. That sweet, innocent smell that only a mother truly appreciates. But Key was so much more than just a devoted mother. She had passions and interests that made her the full, complex person she was. Interior decorating was one of her creative outlets. She had an eye for making spaces beautiful and comfortable. She loved transforming rooms, playing with colors and textures, creating homes that felt warm and inviting. Travel was another passion of hers. Key loved exploring new places, experiencing different cultures, and creating memories with her family. Whether it was a weekend trip or a longer vacation, she approached travel with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else in her life. In the kitchen, Key was in her element. Cooking wasn't just about feeding her large family. It was about creating experiences, bringing people together, and showing love through food. Her children would grow up remembering the smells that came from their mother's kitchen, the way she could turn simple ingredients into something special. Photography was perhaps one of Key's most personal interests. She had a natural talent for capturing moments that mattered. Whether she was behind the camera documenting her children's milestones or posing for photos herself, Kai understood the importance of preserving memories. She knew that photographs would become treasures, especially for a family as large and active as hers. Shopping for her children brought Key genuine joy. Not just the necessities, but finding special items that would make each child feel loved and valued. She paid attention to what each one liked, what made them happy, and she took pleasure in being able to provide for them. Kai was also someone who valued relationships deeply. Her friendship with Christina Ezel was particularly special. The kind of bond that happens when two people truly understand and support each other. Christina would later speak about Key with such love and admiration, describing her as a fearless lioness and protective mama bear. These weren't empty words. They captured the essence of who Key was at her core. Her family in Illinois remained close to her heart throughout her life. Her parents, Scott and Shanitha, her brother Scott Jr., and her sisters Tiara and Tamra, they all stayed connected despite the distance. Key never forgot where she came from. and she made sure her children knew about their extended family and their roots in Peoria. What made Key particularly remarkable was how she balanced being fierce and protective with being genuinely warm and caring. She could be tough when her children needed her to advocate for them, but she could also be incredibly gentle and nurturing when they needed comfort. This balance, being both strong and tender, was something that defined her as both a mother and a person. People who knew Key often commented on her energy and enthusiasm for life. She wasn't someone who just went through the motions. She engaged fully with whatever she was doing, whether it was cheering at a game, planning a family trip, or simply spending an afternoon with her children. Key brought her whole self to every moment. Her home in Humble, Texas, reflected who she was. A place where 6 children could thrive, where love was evident in every corner, where Key had created the kind of environment she had always dreamed of providing for her family. This was the woman whose voice would shake with fear just 2 days before her death, asking about restraining orders and protection. This was the person whose vibrant life would be cut short just as she was trying to ensure her children's safety. The Hightower household had been on law enforcement's radar long before Key made that desperate call about a restraining order. What the neighbors didn't know, what Key's friends couldn't have guessed, was that behind the closed doors of their Atascocita home, a dangerous pattern had been developing for months. Gregory L. Hightower was 37 years old and had built what appeared to be an impressive military career. For 19 years, he had served in the United States Navy, climbing the ranks to become a senior chief recruiter. His specialty was career counseling. Ironically, he was the person other sailors turned to when they needed guidance about their futures, their goals, their paths forward. To those who knew him professionally, Gregory likely seemed like the embodiment of military values: discipline, honor, service. He wore the uniform with pride, carried himself with the confidence that came from nearly 2 decades of naval service, and had achieved a position of leadership and responsibility. On paper, he was exactly the kind of man you'd want your daughter to marry. Stable career, steady income, commitment to serving his country. But Gregory had a secret that his uniform couldn't hide. His rank couldn't protect, and his years of service couldn't excuse. He had a problem controlling his anger, and that anger was increasingly being directed at the woman who had given him 6 children and built a home with him. The first documented incident occurred in July 2022, just 2 months before Key would lose her life. During this confrontation, Key found the courage to make an official accusation against Gregory. She told authorities that he had physically assaulted her. This wasn't a minor disagreement that got out of hand. This was serious enough that Key felt compelled to involve law enforcement. But here's where the system failed her in a way that would prove fatal. When police arrived to investigate Key's allegations, Gregory immediately turned the tables. He made counter-accusations against her, claiming that she had injured him as well. Both parties had visible marks. Both parties claimed the other was at fault, and the responding officers found themselves in what appeared to be a mutual combat situation. In cases like this, prosecutors face a difficult decision. Without clear evidence of who the primary aggressor was, without witnesses to clarify what actually happened, they often choose not to file charges against either party. The thinking is that it's better to avoid prosecution than to risk charging the wrong person or being unable to prove a case in court. So no charges were filed. Gregory faced no consequences for what Key alleged he had done to her. And perhaps more dangerously, Key learned that even when she was brave enough to call for help, even when she was willing to make official statements and involve the legal system, she might not receive the protection she desperately needed. This wasn't an isolated incident. Harris County Sheriff's deputies had been called to the Hightower residence multiple times for what they classified as domestic prevention calls. These are the kind of calls that officers dread. Situations where tensions are high, emotions are raw, and violence feels imminent, but no crime has technically been committed yet. Each time deputies arrived, they would find a couple in conflict. Sometimes there were accusations. Sometimes there were denials. Sometimes both parties would claim to be victims. But time after time, the situation would de-escalate enough for officers to leave without making arrests, and the cycle would continue. What makes Gregory's behavior particularly troubling is that it was happening despite his military training and position. The Navy doesn't just teach technical skills, it emphasizes honor, integrity, and personal responsibility. Gregory had spent nearly 2 decades in an environment where accountability was paramount, where actions had consequences, where protecting the innocent was considered a sacred duty. Yet somehow, this same man who counseled other sailors about making good life choices was systematically terrorizing the mother of his children. The disconnect between his professional persona and his private behavior reveals something deeply disturbing about his character. Military domestic violence cases present unique challenges for both victims and law enforcement. Service members often have access to weapons training that makes them more dangerous when they become violent. They understand tactics, they know how to intimidate, and they're accustomed to having authority and control. Additionally, military families often feel pressure to handle problems internally, to avoid bringing shame on the service member's career or the family's reputation. There's an unspoken expectation that military spouses should be strong, that they should support their service member no matter what, that seeking help might be seen as weakness or betrayal. Key was caught in this impossible situation. She loved Gregory, or at least loved the man she thought he could be. She wanted her children to have their father in their lives. She probably hoped that his behavior would improve, that the stress of military life was contributing to his anger, that they could work through their problems together. But by summer 2022, it was becoming clear that hope wasn't enough. The incidents were escalating. The violence was becoming more frequent and more severe. Key was running out of options, and perhaps more importantly, she was running out of time. The July incident should have been a turning point. It should have resulted in consequences that might have saved Key's life. Instead, it became just another missed opportunity, another failure of a system that wasn't equipped to protect her when she needed it most. What do you think? Should military personnel face different or more severe consequences when they commit domestic violence? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thursday, September 22nd, 2022. 2 days had passed since Key made that fateful phone call about the restraining order. 2 days of normal life, feeding babies, getting children ready for school, maintaining the routines that kept her large household running smoothly. What Key didn't know was that her husband's superiors in the Navy had been paying attention to what was happening in their marriage. The military takes domestic violence allegations seriously, especially when they involve senior personnel like Gregory. So when complaints about his behavior reached the right people, they decided to take action. That Thursday afternoon, at approximately 1:30 p.m., 2 Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents arrived at the Hightower home in Atascocita. These weren't local police officers or sheriff's deputies. These were federal investigators with the authority to investigate crimes involving Navy personnel. Their presence at Key's home represented exactly what she had been hoping for. Official intervention, serious consequences, and real protection. The NCIS agents weren't there for a casual conversation or a routine check-in. They were conducting a formal interview with Key about the domestic violence allegations she had made against her husband. This was her opportunity to tell her story, on the record, to investigators who had the power to hold Gregory accountable for his actions. Key cooperated fully. She sat in her own living room, cradling one of her babies. The child was just 12 months old, still dependent on his mother for everything. As she spoke to the agents, explaining what had been happening in her marriage, describing the fear she lived with every day, she probably felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. For the first time since those terrifying incidents had begun escalating, Key was being taken seriously by people with real authority. The NCIS agents listened to her account, asked detailed questions, and documented everything she told them. This wasn't another situation where competing stories would cancel each other out. This was a professional investigation into serious criminal allegations. But Gregory knew exactly what was happening in his home that afternoon. Somehow he had learned that federal investigators were interviewing his wife. Whether he saw their vehicles, received a tip, or simply suspected what Key might do after her call about the restraining order, he realized that his world was about to change dramatically. A formal NCIS investigation could end his military career. Domestic violence convictions carry serious consequences for service members: loss of rank, discharge from the military, loss of benefits, and criminal penalties. Everything Gregory had built over 19 years of naval service was suddenly at risk. Rather than face accountability for his actions, rather than accept the consequences of what he had done to the mother of his children, Gregory made a choice that would destroy multiple lives in a matter of seconds. At 1:30 that afternoon, while Key was speaking to NCIS agents about seeking protection from her husband, Gregory burst into their home. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He forced his way into the house where his wife was finally, for the first time, getting the help she desperately needed. And then he opened fire. The bullet struck Key while she was holding their baby. This woman, who had spent 34 years loving others, who had devoted her life to raising 6 children, who had found the courage to seek official help despite knowing the risks, she was murdered in her own living room while federal agents watched in horror. The chaos was immediate and devastating. An NCIS agent was wounded in the gunfire, though he would later survive his injuries. The baby Key had been holding somehow escaped physical harm, as did a toddler who was also present in the home during the attack. But Key, the devoted mother, the fearless lioness who had finally found the courage to seek protection, was gone. Gregory didn't stay to face what he had done. As soon as the shooting stopped, he fled the scene, leaving behind 6 children who would never see their mother again, federal agents dealing with a crime scene beyond imagination, and a community that would struggle to understand how such violence could happen in broad daylight. But his escape wouldn't last long. Law enforcement agencies across the Houston area were immediately mobilized to find him. Gregory drove to a relative's apartment in northwest Houston, perhaps thinking he could hide, perhaps hoping he could avoid the consequences of what he had just done. 3 hours later, sheriff's deputies located him. When they moved in to arrest him, Gregory made his final choice. Rather than surrender, rather than face trial for murdering his wife in front of federal agents, he opened fire on the deputies. The shootout was brief but decisive. Gregory Hightower, the Navy senior chief who had spent 19 years serving his country, died in that exchange of gunfire. His death ensured that he would never face trial for Kai's murder, never be held accountable in a courtroom, never have to explain to his children why he killed their mother. In the span of less than 4 hours, 6 children lost both parents. Kai's family lost a beloved daughter, sister, and mother. The community lost a vibrant woman whose only crime was seeking safety for herself and her children. The NCIS agents who had come to Key's home to investigate domestic violence allegations had instead witnessed the ultimate act of domestic terrorism: a husband choosing murder over accountability. In the immediate hours following that Thursday afternoon tragedy, 6 young children faced a reality no child should ever have to comprehend. Ages ranging from just 12 months to 6 years old, they had lost both parents in a single day. Their mother to violence, their father to his own destructive choices. But Key's family refused to let these children become forgotten casualties of domestic violence. Within days of the shooting, Key's mother, Takara Glenn, made a decision that would define the rest of her life. This grandmother, already dealing with her own devastating grief over losing her daughter, stepped forward to take custody of 5 of Key's children. This wasn't a temporary arrangement or a stopgap solution. Takara, along with Key's sisters Tiara and Tamara, committed to raising these children as their own. They understood that these kids would need stability, love, and continuity during the most traumatic period of their young lives. The family structure that Key had worked so hard to create wouldn't be completely destroyed. It would be rebuilt by the people who had loved her most. But even as they focused on caring for the children, Key's family recognized that her death represented something larger than a personal tragedy. This wasn't just a domestic dispute that escalated. This was a systemic failure. that cost a woman her life while she was actively seeking protection. 6 months after Key's death, her family made a decision that would honor her memory while potentially saving other lives. Through their attorney, Laura Higginbotham, they filed a federal lawsuit against the United States Navy. This wasn't about money or revenge. This was about accountability and change. The lawsuit makes specific allegations that are both damning and heartbreaking. According to the family's legal filing, the Navy failed to remove the guns from Gregory despite knowing about the domestic violence allegations. They failed to provide protection to Key even as she cooperated with their investigation. Most devastatingly, Gregory was allowed to access the home with his guns and came in and shot her, while NCIS officers were present and supposedly protecting her. These allegations raise fundamental questions about how domestic violence cases are handled within military families. If federal investigators knew enough about Gregory's behavior to conduct a formal interview with Key, why wasn't he disarmed? If the Navy considered him dangerous enough to warrant an NCIS investigation, why was he allowed to move freely while his wife was giving testimony against him? The family's attorney conveyed their deeper motivation for pursuing this case. They want to get their story out to say, hey, look, no matter what position you are in life, you should be able to get the help that you need so domestic violence doesn't happen to other families. This statement cuts to the heart of a troubling reality. Key had done everything right. She had reported previous incidents to local police. She had inquired about restraining orders. She had cooperated with federal investigators. She had sought protection through every available channel. Yet the system failed to keep her safe when it mattered most. The timing of Key's murder, occurring while NCIS agents were in her home, exposes a critical gap in domestic violence intervention protocols. Current procedures often focus on gathering evidence and building cases, but they don't always prioritize the immediate physical safety of victims during the most dangerous phase of their situation. Domestic violence experts have long recognized that the period when a victim decides to leave or seek official help is statistically the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship. Abusers often escalate to extreme violence when they sense losing control. Yet many intervention protocols don't adequately account for this heightened risk. Key's case demonstrates that even federal law enforcement presence isn't enough to guarantee safety when dealing with a determined and volatile abuser. Gregory's actions that Thursday afternoon show the lengths some perpetrators will go to avoid accountability, even when it means destroying their own lives in the process. The community response to Key's death has been profound and lasting. Friends have established memorial funds to support her children's education and future needs. Local domestic violence organizations have used her story to highlight the urgent need for better protection protocols. Her best friend Christina Azell continues to advocate for domestic violence awareness, ensuring that Key's memory serves a purpose beyond grief. Perhaps most importantly, Key's children are growing up, knowing that their mother was a woman of courage who tried to protect them. As they mature, they'll understand that she didn't die because she was weak or passive. She died because she was brave enough to seek help and the system wasn't strong enough to protect her. The federal lawsuit continues to move through the courts, potentially setting precedents for how military domestic violence cases are handled in the future. Win or lose, the family's willingness to pursue justice publicly keeps Key's story in the spotlight and forces institutions to examine their policies and procedures. Today, when Takara Glenn looks at her 5 grandchildren, she sees Key's legacy living on. These children are thriving despite unimaginable trauma, supported by a family that refuses to let their mother's death be meaningless. They're growing up knowing they were loved fiercely by a woman who died trying to keep them safe. Key's story serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to action. It reminds us that domestic violence can happen to anyone, in any family, regardless of education, income, or social status. It also challenges us to demand better from the systems designed to protect vulnerable people. Subscribe to stay updated on the legal case and continue learning about domestic violence prevention. Share this video to spread awareness, and remember, Key's legacy lives on through every person who decides to speak up, seek help, or support someone who needs protection.